Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today, we're joined by Ainsley Brown. He's the Senior Director of Regulations, Policy, Monitoring, and Enforcement at the Jamaica Special Economic Zone Authority. Ainsley, thank you so much for joining the show.
Yes, you're welcome.
Absolutely. So maybe we could go a little chronologically here, because it's an interesting transition. Your career trajectory. You didn't start out in government per se or zones per se. And you didn't even start out in Jamaica. You actually began your career as a Canadian lawyer. Can you sort of walk us through what that career path was for you?
Okay, sure. Well, I basically I was born in Jamaica, and then I moved when I was 13 to Canada. So I spent I think it's 22, 23 years in Canada. I also had 2 years in the UK studying. But I became an attorney. The whole reason why I became an attorney was I actually know the moment. I was 16, and it was the WTO, World Trade Organization's case, Bananas case. And I know it impacted Jamaica. I was in Canada, and I somehow, this is the the internet did exist, but this was pre, the different search engines that are about, but somehow I got a hold of excerpts or the judgment itself, and I was reading it and couldn't make heads or tails of it. So who wrote this? A lawyer. Okay, well, I guess that's what I need to be, because I knew that it impacted Jamaica severely, because bananas was one of our main industries from the agro sector. So from there, I took a journey as, I'm going to be a lawyer, and I studied political science, and then went to the UK, studied, came back to Canada, and then became called to the bar there in Canada. And while I was there, I always had a dream of exiting the profession. Because for me, law isn't just a profession, it is a system, it's a way of thinking. So I discerned that quite early. So while I wouldn't necessarily want to practice law for my entire life, I knew I wanted to exit. And luckily, an opportunity came up sooner than I thought, with Jamaica's drive to become or position itself as a logistics hub. And once I heard that, I needed no explanation, I needed no details. I understood it right away. In fact, everything I've ever studied to that point became useful. Like I studied, Chinese and Japanese foreign policy, and I already saw how that could play out in what the logistics hub would look like, and so forth. So I literally, the day after my birthday, packed up and moved back to Jamaica. And from there, we then developed, the framework for the logistics hub and position in the country. And one of the great, policy tools from it was the SEZ. And so, I did the initial policy paper for it, then assisted with the policy development, and also assisted with the drafting of the legislation, including the regulations.
So you helped implement it. You weren't just there as it was already operating. You were crucial in its founding.
Correct.
Very cool.
Correct. Amongst others, we have a pretty solid team, from our CEO, our COO, and our infrastructure and special projects. That was that, and myself. That's the core. We were there from day one, and logistics hub. So the Special Economic Zone Authority, we also still carry the policy initiative side of the logistics hub, but in terms of implementation, we are very focused on SEZs, of course. So from the policy, the law, all the way to boots on the ground kind of thing.
Interesting. So I guess maybe it makes sense to talk a little bit first about Jamaica's large ambition as a logistics hub. So what is that vision exactly?
Yeah, sometimes it's misunderstood because people get stuck on the word logistics. And instantly you think, okay, so it's trucks and ships and all of that, and you know,
Ports.
not and ports and DHL and UPS, and it's like, yes, all of that plus more, right? Um, it's I like to start calling it a logistics and trade hub, because when I say that, people go, oh, I get it, right? Because what it's about plugging into the value chains. We have value chains that, you know, crisscross the world. Some plug into Jamaica, and we're integrated in it in some ways, in terms of, you know, sometimes very shallow, sometimes a little bit deeper. But we have an opportunity based on our geography, based on our history, based on basically just us being us, that we can tap into certain value chains. Like, I'll give you an example that COVID has brought up. You know, you have masks, and PPEs in general, but masks specifically. And, you know, a lot of people don't know, but most of the masks, surgical masks and so forth, you know, the ones with the really strong filters, I can't remember the name of it now. It's a letter and numbers. Can't remember the name right now. They are basically a form of plastic, you know, and it's causing severe plastic pollution. We're starting to see that. We recently banned, I think 2 years ago, single-use plastic, and that has helped to clean up our environment. But then now with COVID, we're actually seeing somewhat of a reversal. Now, we have, you know, different kinds of fibers here that can be used, that are, you know, of a certain grade, that can be weaved into organic masks and are much safer for the environment. So we have that. What we haven't, what we don't have right now is an investor that will connect all of that, or all of those dots. But the dots are here in Jamaica. We just need to now go seek out those investors, because it won't be one, because there's a whole chain that you need to facilitate and regulate. And, you know, part of what I do is called economic regulation. And that may have some, you know, there's old school looking at economic regulation from a perspective of a utilities regulator who, you know, is regulating a monopoly, or you know, a couple companies. But the modern economic regulator looks at things from a perspective of enabling the ecosystem. And that's what we're doing. We're enabling the ecosystem, allowing for linkages from the zones into the domestic economy, and from the zones internationally.
So that's an interesting point, because if I think a lot of people who are getting into special economic zones, you think that you set up the framework and then you just simply let the companies go. But what you're saying is that the zone actually has an active role, almost an entrepreneurial role, in saying, hey, look, you should be focusing on this, or you should be connecting with this partner to integrate with the backward and forward linkages. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Correct. We view ourselves, and in fact, our legislation, it doesn't specifically say it, but how the legislation, our act, and our regulations are crafted is we are a economic development agency. We're not just a strict regulator of don't do this or do this. And if you step out of line, here's your punishment. That's not what we're about. We're about economic development. Granted, it's confined within the SEZ, but we are one major cog in a larger wheel within the logistics hub framework. So we have to you know, work with both public sector, private sector. We've set up an aftercare team, which, you know, you're in the system, and if there's a problem, it's our duty to solve it. Your problem is our problem. If you have a problem, we have a problem, and we need to sort it out as quickly as possible, because we want as little disruption to your business as possible. And that's the attitude that we take to these things.
So what you're saying brings up a lot of possible questions about really core things about zones, which is administration and the relationship between the private and public sector. What is the relationship for administration and private and public in the Jamaican framework?
Yeah, our zones are primarily private sector driven. There are some public sector zones. In fact, the largest ones are public sector, which is a legacy from our free zone days from dating back from the early 70s in the garment sector and so forth. But we have some zones in the pipeline that are, once they get up and running, will eclipse those because they're much larger than the zones that we have that are public run. So the authority itself cannot run zones, or let me preface that a little bit. The only time we can run zones is in a disaster or emergency situation where we have to step in to take over a zone temporarily while, say, a developer has been suspended. We have to protect the occupants. And that's not something we ever want to do. We also have the right through, you have the license agreement for the regular developers, whether they're public sector or private sector. We also have what's called a master concession, which is lands, those are lands that belong to the authority, but we must find a private sector developer. So we can put in, brick and mortar and set it up, but we cannot run it. It's just against our principles. We're private sector driven. That doesn't mean that we can't cooperate and do different ventures with the private sector. That's very much encouraged, but we can't run it. There's an inherent conflict there wherein the regulator is the operator. Unless you have unless the zones are owned and operated entirely by the government, which some countries have that model, but we have not gone with that model. We are encouraging both local and international capital to come and invest.
And the job of these developers, is it mainly to develop infrastructure and find tenants, or do they also do policy facilitation, or is that the job of the zone authority?
It's the former. They basically build the infrastructure and lease it out. They do have a role in terms of, it's their zone. So if there are issues happening with their occupants, they should let us know. The occupants, of course, can come to us directly to say, hey, I'm having this problem, especially if it's with the developer. I'm having this problem. Let's see what we can do to sort it out. But the developers are primarily infrastructure focused, and that's why we have a shortage of zones, and especially modern built zones. Many of our even the public sector ones, some of the buildings date back to the 70s, and we need to modernize. So we have specifically incentivized the developers. So their corporate income tax rate is set at 0 because we want development. We want developers to come in. Whereas the occupants, the headline rate is 12.5%, which they can bring down to as low as 7.75 with the application of certain performance-based tax credits, such as employment. So we really want the developers to come along and build.
So it sounds like you have a great set of fiscal incentives. And I know you actually have had a couple podcasts on this topic, the distinction between different types of benefits. Do you also have a streamlined regulatory code or other benefits besides fiscal and tax incentives?
Well, most of the incentives are fiscal in nature. So we have, of course, duty-free importation of anything that remains in the zone, whether it's raw materials to build or raw materials to actually in your manufacturing or in your service operation, computers and all that. We have a big segment of BPO, business process outsourcers, call centers in our zones, and they bring in headsets and computers and servers and all that good stuff. We also have, and this is where we try to incentivize the linkage. We have a value added tax. If you buy from the domestic territory, the regular Jamaica, not the zone Jamaica, that's 0 rated. So you move from 15% to 0. So electricity, for example, is your bills are 15% less. Water, 15% less. If you hire cleaners or security guards or some sort of consultants, well, those are 15% less because we're incentivizing the linkage with the domestic economy. We want people to, not necessarily import those goods and services, but to utilize Jamaica. That was one of the major changes from the free zone days, that wasn't focused in that area. We didn't have that focus on those backward linkages. We also have other incentives, which are non-fiscal. And like I said before, our aftercare team. We're using government services. This is something that we've learned quite early when we were developing our policy and law, that we have to use government services as the incentive itself, the facilitation itself. We don't have a cost to that as at now, but we're looking to implement certain costs to speed up things, speed up approvals. We don't have direct control over those approvals because there's other government agencies that have that legislative remit. But we're in dialogue, we're signing MOUs, we're working on service level agreements to ensure that quality and all of that is maintained. And, somebody comes to us and says, well, I need this permit and, I want your services. And we say, well, yeah, we can get it to you in 5 days. Normally it's 30 days. We have to ensure that that happens, and that becomes the incentive.
Interesting. And it also seems from the headlines that there are some innovative things that Jamaica is specifically doing with licenses. In fact, I've heard that there's even been talks of creating a digital one-stop shop for permits for users in the zone. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, that's early. We're in the early stages of that. We are actually undertaking a ISO training or ISO designation. We've done the training actually for quality standards, so that greater efficiencies can be derived, greater accountability, greater transparency. Everyone knows, you apply for this, it takes 5 days, it's delivered, 99.999% of the time within 5 days or less. So that's part of what we're doing. Another aspect, certain aspects I can't really speak about yet because we haven't publicly announced them, but we are working on building out a certain framework. What we want to do actually, because this has been announced, I can speak to it. We actually want to build something using blockchain with other government agencies so that everything is authenticated very quickly, and there's safety and security around data and all of that, data protection, so that when somebody applies for something, we know the system is alerted. Okay, this needs to be done. So right now, for example, we're in discussions with our customs agency to streamline certain processes, which would be literally a click of a button on our end. Right now it's paper-based. It's still within 24 to 48 hours, it's done, but we can reduce that to potentially minutes. So we're looking into that, meetings and certain discussions, but customs, which sits on our board, is very much on board with it because they see the improvement in their services as well as ours, and we work very closely with them as our regulatory partners. We're also looking to work, well, we are working with our tax authorities to ensure that certain things are done and can be automated. We have worked with, so the GCT, as I was saying, the value added tax, we've worked out a system which zero rates it, and the tax authorities moving towards digitization greatly. So they've started to digitize a lot more before COVID, but COVID, of course, has accelerated this digitization as around the world. So that's one of those areas that we want to have further digitized. It's digitized right now because I think in the initial phase, when you first register, it's a bit paper-based, but once you're on the system, it is relatively automated. But we've seen areas where we could improve, and we're in a continuous improvement environment, and that's part of what we do at the authority, or part of our philosophy. So where we can see greater efficiencies, we try to get them.
And it's kind of your job, sort of monitoring how policies are progressing and seeing how they can be altered or changed. Or maybe I'm mischaracterizing it. Either way, the
No,
point
that's
being.
part of my job. That's part
Okay.
of my job.
Well, I'd love to hear what your job is, because it sounds fascinating to me.
My job, it's sometimes a little difficult to explain, because people, when they hear the regulations, or wow, regulations. This is the cop. This is the police, right? Policy. Oh, okay. And then when they hear the last bit, monitoring and enforcement, they're like, I don't want to talk to you anymore, because you're the guy that's going to be digging. And in some ways that's true, but we have we borrowed from our good friends from Singapore. And what we want is self-compliance. We're not about the big stick. The big stick exists, don't get me wrong, but it is break in case of emergency. Like we don't want to use that, right? We don't break the glass in case of emergency. We don't want to go down that road. So we have a certain look and feel where we're trying to be or in many ways we are a anticipatory regulator. We see where you could go wrong and we alert you. Please don't do this. And
Could you give an example?
So for example, a company, in the past, our free zone regime wasn't as regulated. So a company or companies in the past have set up operations because there was a misinterpretation of the law to say that I am the one that has been designated, my company, so I can go anywhere I want and set up anywhere I want. And it's like, no, you are bound by geography. This area has been designated for you, or this is a zone, and then you can be in that zone. You're approved to be in that zone, so you can't go to another zone without approval or go elsewhere. So there was a bit of misunderstanding there. We had a transition exercise, which turned out to be more of a regularization exercise that we undertook last year. And so what you'll find is sometimes companies will go, I'm expanding, I'm growing, I'm creating more jobs. Great, we love that. But there's a certain pathway that you must follow. So they'll go ahead and, go and open a location and start operating. And then you go, how is that possible? Either you're in the zone or you're not. You can't be in both, right? If you're in both, you're gonna have to do some sort of separation, a different company. Additionally, you would have gotten, duty-free items. Those duty-free items are technically now within the domestic territory. So customs has a problem. We have a problem, customs has a problem. The tax administration has a problem because you're earning income that's not within the zone. So, our normal tax rate is 25%. So they'll be looking to say, well, you owe us some money.
So, honestly, this whole example surprises me that actually happened, because it kind of defeats the whole purpose of his own program to begin with.
Correct. So that, again, it's a legacy of the misinterpretation that I as a company has been designated, not that there is geography that has been designated. So because of that, there's a little bit of education, and that's another part of what we do. We have the philosophy of educate, facilitate, regulate, and we attack that very aggressively. And the regulation side of things, the enforcement comes last. It comes first and last because we're trying to get people to follow the rules, but enforcement, as in the big stick, comes last. We don't wish to go down that road, but if it happens, it happens. But we try every which way we detect. So this has happened. This example that I've given you is live. When we detect it, we actually move very aggressively to correct and regulate the space. For the most part, and tax and customs may not like me saying this, we've shielded our clients a little bit, but increasingly, because of the nature of the relationship, we know that we shouldn't really be doing that. So we're stepping up and saying, you know what, we have stepped up the education side and the facilitation side. You know, we have to step up the regulations side in terms of, you know, if you do this, there's potential for adverse consequences, not necessarily from us, but from other authorities. So that's it. It is what it is, basically, you know.
Interesting. So it sounds like sort of the theme of that is of regulation that you're saying. Your philosophy is to provide information so that they self-regulate. So information
Correct.
is key. But another part of your job isn't just giving information to tenants and zone developers. It's also analyzing information and data.
Correct.
What does that part of your job look like?
That is very early days right now. We're setting up some systems right now. We have we're developing a self-reporting form. Well, forms, I should say, because they vary slightly depending on your identity and also your reporting requirements. The developers would self-report twice per year, and also the occupants report quarterly. What we have done, though, is because we have partnerships with other regulatory bodies, we have primarily tax and customs, they're on our board, for example. We have requested information from them. And what we're doing is we're actually creating a performance index. And in fact, I think, was it either Friday, I might cancel that meeting, but next week I should be having a meeting. We're looking at both the metrics and the analytics. So for example, of that, we would say, okay, so the metric is how many jobs are there, you know, per company, per zone, overall, right? But then we know how much square footage there is. So one good analytic would be how many jobs are there per square foot. So we can check density. That has become all the more important in COVID. So we can keep track of that. We also want to have, because we have adopted, it's government policy, but we have adopted the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We also have a national development plan, which is called Vision 2030. And we have our SEZ policy and our logistics hub industry analysis and master plan. And we've combined those into a sustainable development framework. And we analyze you from your entrance into the zone, and we monitor, you know, so if you've added a job, we note that. But also what we want to see is, you know, greater gender equality, more women in managerial positions. So we know, for example, we've been to, you know, a BPO operation, and you have the technical side of things, and then you have the call center side of things. And literally it's, you know, technical, it's 99% men. And then the call center is 99% women. And then management is primarily men. So we want to see a shifting of that, more equality around pay, around opportunity. We also want to see equality or things being put in place to enable the disabled community. So it's not just about, you know, equality, but put it forward an enabling environment so that, you know, everybody who can contribute positively to society. That's the kind of philosophy that we have at the Zone Authority.
So it's really great that you are integrated into larger international institutions like you know, like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Is your zone also participating in trade associations like the WFCO, for instance, or other programs of the WTO, for example?
Yes, we are actually members of the Free Zone, World Free Zone organization. We actually won the bid to host the next annual conference, which is next year. Of course, now
Very cool.
COVID is around, so we have to be facilitated in certain things. It may be a blended approach in terms of being online and offline. There are a lot of what ifs, but we're proceeding there. We're also the national contact point for the World Free Zone organization. Additionally, well, the country is a member of the WTO. So we have to follow. In fact, that's part of the reason why we shifted from calling ourselves Free Zone to SEZ. We had to comply with the countervailing duties agreement. In addition, we have a situation where the country is a member of the World Customs Organization, and we are underway to become members of or sent to the revised Kyoto Convention. Well, I'm biased, I will say, because of zones, but one of the key features of that is customs control over zones, whether you call them free zones, industrial parks, SEZ, whatever you want to call them. It's important that customs, and we're already there. The law and regulations make clear that customs, while they may not charge you duty, they need to know exactly what you brought in and what you're taking out. So that is clear. So we're members of different bodies, either directly or by extension, because the country is a member.
Excellent. And it sounds like you already have a very robust framework. It seems like you're doing all the right things by plugging into existing institutions that have high goals. And it seems that the zones are growing at a huge pace. There's billions of dollars this year alone in COVID to the Jamaican Special Economic Zone program. So one could say from an outside perspective, what else could one want? But as in with every organization, individuals think that there are ways that could be improved. And we usually like to conclude our podcast with sort of a speculative question. So I'd like to posit to you, if you had the ability to make some changes within the Special Economic Zone framework of Jamaica, what are things that you would focus on?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. And funnily enough, we've already started that work. There are several things. There's from the legislative side, and then there's from the implementation side. COVID has hit us hard. Projects of either, we haven't seen any cancellations. Thankfully, we've seen delays. People are slowing down a bit. Some people had no choice. We were on lockdown at some point, or parts of the island were on lockdown, so there was nothing happening. But some of the areas that I would love to see is, for example, the integration of standards into the legislation, and a reward system within the legislation. You get rewarded for doing the right things. We want to move up. Standards are critical. Standards are key to plugging into value chains globally, and we want to reward people that are doing the right things. There are some little technical issues that need to be clarified within the law. And I would like to see, even though it's there, more emphasis on the economic development side of things, not just the strict, regulator. You're the regulator. You tell them the do's and the don'ts, and enforce it. It's more, no, we are there for that, yes, but we are there for development purposes. We need to strengthen the framework around the master concession, around how exactly the authority gets lands and what it can do with the lands and such and so forth. And also certain areas for income diversification for the authority. We would love to see some of those changes happen. Overall, what I would love to, because this is the very reason or part of the reason why we exist. We're here for economic development, and we're here for diversification of the Jamaican economy, and diversification not just in products, but in our source of FDI, our the markets that we trade with, whether goods or services, and also the complexity of what we do. I think we're the third largest alumina exporter, but we don't produce aluminum. We produce the raw material, but we don't have a smelter. We don't have a recycling program that can take back aluminum cans and recycle them and turn that into reusable products. We try to, we've coined a term called sustainability, and sustainability and livity. Livity is a term we borrowed from our Rastafarian friends, which in essence it means many things. It's life, it's living in harmony with nature, with other human beings. It's livelihood. So it's all, it's not one of those by itself, it's all of them combined. So we've combined the two terms, sustainability, to say that that's the type of zones that we want, that's the type of investment that we want, that's the type of trade that we want, and it's uniquely Jamaican. So yes, there's sustainable development goals and all that, but you can come to Jamaica, we have another phrase, we say doing business in paradise, and live and work and invest in a sustainability way,
Well, so it sounds like you have a fantastic vision, and I think a lot of our viewers will resonate with that. And I guess that's what I want my last question to center around, because a lot of our viewers are people that are looking to get into the zone industry, but don't really know where to start or where to look at specifically. You obviously have gone through the gambit of helping found a framework to helping running and scaling it and improving upon it. So what advice would you give to someone who's trying to get into this space?
I would say that find your unique selling point, your value proposition or value propositions, because it may be more than one, and ground your zone framework around that. We started with the logistics hub. We still have it, and we're grounded around that, and we're working towards building out Jamaica as a logistics-centered economy. So find that thing and pursue it. In addition, don't be afraid to ask for help. There's a lot of assistance out there, whether from the World Bank or even just in general. People are willing to help you out. In addition, look at what has worked and also look at what has not worked around the world. And it's not a case of build it and they will come. Build it and then you got to promote it. Then you have to, shift, pivot. It's all of those things. It's not a set it and forget it.
Like a normal company, like a normal organization.
Exactly. And you have to determine what model works best for you. Is it going to be more, state-centric? The country or the controls the zones and regulates the zones, or will you be more private sector driven? And of course, you have to ensure that there is proper governance in place to ensure transparency and accountability. Those are actually, may sound funny to people, but those are actually incentives. If people know that their money, they'll invest their money and it's secure and you deal with them in a fair, transparent, accountable way, they're more likely to come to you. Your fiscal incentive might be not as good, but because you're doing these other things, they're like, you know what? I'd rather be there than here. And also, importantly, you can't be all things to everyone. You have to focus. You can't say, well, I'm going to do, you know, everything. I'm gonna have a tourism zone. I'm gonna have an industrial zone, and it's all going to be blended up together. You can't be all things to all people. Also, you have to do a situation analysis. You have to look at where you are right now and then where you want to go. And also look at your industries and the products that you produce now. Is it that you want those to be advanced in a certain way through a linkage, or do you want them directly in the zone? And note that you may have to sacrifice in terms of giving up certain revenues, fiscal revenues right now to earn later. And pay attention as well to the fourth industrial revolution. That's here. That's not the future. That is here right now. And it's changing a lot of things. Particularly, I would warn policymakers around the to pay close attention to the moratorium on electronic transmission or electronic duties on electronic transmissions that is within the WTO. You know, it was put in place early, in the early days of the internet, because, you know, what's the internet? No one knew what it was and what it would do. But now you have trillion-dollar companies like Apple and Google and so forth. And people are looking to, how do I get my fair share of that revenue? And, you know, there's discussions right across the board to see how duties could be imposed on electronic transmissions. And that becomes, just think about it for a second, 3D printing. You know, you import something and then you charge a duty on it. Okay, so I have a 3D printer and the same product, I print it, there's no duty. So pay attention to these new developments and pay attention to supply chains. That would be my advice.
Well, Ainsley, thank you so much. Our viewers got a great view of the nitty-gritty of on the ground, how to manage and found a special economic zone. So thank you so much. And everyone, make sure to check out his work and check out the Jamaican Special Economic Zone Authority. Ainsley, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Yeah, you're welcome.